Good. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming. I hope you didn't find the entrance to the museum too much of a maze tonight, what with the escalator and lift out of order. I have to confess that when I applied for this professorship, I had to propose 18 lectures, and so the first 6 are this year's lectures. And when I came to write this evening's lecture and saw that my title was Reading as a Reader and Reading as a Critic, I couldn't immediately remember quite what I'd had in mind. But for those of you who haven't been to all of the earlier lectures, I know some of you have, which is delightful. I think the logic was something like this. The first was, what is reading? And I wanted to propose that reading is a much more complex process than we realise. We take it very much for granted. The most succinct example of this, I think, is rereading a book and thinking, heck, it's not the same book. So what's going on when we read? It's not stable. Then the second one was reading for pleasure. Again, it's a phrase we use a lot, but it implies that a lot of our reading may not be for pleasure, and what do we really mean by reading for pleasure? And then 3 and 4 were more historical, looking at reading in the ancient world and questioning whether the way people read then was the same as the way we read now. And then reading in modern context, that was really largely about the rise of the novel and how most of what we read now, which we don't read for the purposes of our work, is probably likely to be the novel. And why did the novel come to dominate in the way that it did in the modern period? So I think what I thought should follow on from there was consideration of reading again, but reading in the technical, more technical way that you might say a literary critic reads. And so that's what I would like to address this evening. A comment that my undergraduate students occasionally make, which rather worries me, given that my day job, as it were, is teaching literary analysis. Sometimes one of them will say, "Oh, that's really spoilt the poem." And I think, oh dear, well, you're here to learn how to analyse literature. So if it's spoilt it, then it's problematic. On the other hand, of course, I know what they mean, because when we read, we want to be seduced. And knowing how the seduction works is something rather different. I think we can make an analogy between knowing how the seduction works when we work out how a literary text is actually functioning, both in terms of words and form and structure and so on. So what I want to do this evening is to think about how literary texts work their magic on us. And I want to propose that there can be 2 simultaneous pleasures. One is being seduced by the language of the literary text, and the other is being canny about the way in which we've been seduced. Ovid, so these ideas have been around for a long time. Ovid warned women readers to be very circumspect reading love letters, and said, you've got to bear in mind what it is they want from you. So don't just read the letter and take it all straight. Now, I don't think he meant don't enjoy reading love letters. What he meant was, well, make sure they're sincere before you enjoy their flattery or whatever it might be. I also think that reflecting on the way in which literary texts work can give us an insight into their truth. Now, by truth, I don't mean factual truth, but whether or not they really convince us, whether they have the power to convince us. And of course, it was truth that Ovid was getting at when he said, be circumspect when you read these love letters. In a lecture by Virginia Woolf, which later became an essay entitled How Should One Read a Book?, she said, every literature, as it grows old, has its rubbish heap. And what's on this rubbish heap has no value. And she says, and I quote, it is negligible in the extreme, yet how absorbing. Well, we all know that a lightweight novel that we buy at an airport can help us pass the time, can distract us on a flight. But what Woolf goes on to say is that we tire of rubbish reading in the long run. Now, we might be tempted to dismiss Virginia Woolf as a literary snob, but what she goes on to say is this, and I quote, "We tire of searching for what is needed to complete the half-truth. We tire of searching for what is needed to complete the half-truth." Now, what she's saying is that second-rate reading that goes onto the rubbish heap, doesn't really convince us of its truth. We have to give it a helping hand. Yeah? So we read a fast thriller, and we don't actually feel hugely convinced that this could be life. We agree, in a funny sense, to be caught up in it, but we have to supply some of the truth to make it work. Facts, according to Woolf, and I quote, "are all that they can offer us, and facts are a very inferior form of fiction." So, to illustrate this idea that fiction can be factual and therefore not really seduce us, or it can be something else, I want to talk about the opening of one of Woolf's novels, Mrs. Dalloway. And what I've done is to make a slight alteration to the opening sentence. So if there are any Woolf fans in the audience, I apologise. So this is my version of Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway said she was going to buy some flowers. Now, what Virginia Woolf wrote was actually, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Now, it's a small alteration. There's a change in verbal mood. We've got the flowers rather than some flowers, and that she would buy the flowers herself. Now, in Woolf's example, we begin in medias res. In other words, we begin in the middle of things, because clearly there's been some discussion about who was going to buy the flowers. That's not the case with my version. And when we read Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, we might sense a certain sort of pathos. Oh, she's going to have to go herself to buy the flowers. It might actually stimulate a slightly emotional response, which Mrs. Dalloway said she was going to buy some flowers doesn't solicit. So here, I think, when Virginia Woolf's talking about the truth of fiction, there's something persuasive about the second one. One feels that this is the way life is, that there are complexities and complications. And one thinks, well, has she been let down? Has she been abandoned to this task of buying the flowers herself? But in fact, that reading has to be... I'm afraid my thingy isn't working yet. That reading has to be reconsidered as the novel continues, because directly after Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, we get, for Lucy had her work cut out for her, the doors would be taken off their hinges, Rumpelmayer's men were coming, and then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge, for so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Boughton into the open air. How fresh, how calm. Stiller than this, of course. The air was, in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn. So this is Woolf in very dense linguistic mode. And we move from Mrs. Dalloway, clearly as a mature woman, thinking, no, I'll buy the flowers because Lucy's got her work cut out for her, to what's running through Clarissa's mind, Dalloway's mind, which is the doors are going to be taken off their hinges, there's going to be decoration, and seamlessly we're taken back to what her experience of going to Boughton as an 18-year-old girl was like, when the doors were flung open and the beginning of summer happened. And we learn a number of things about Mrs. Dalloway that we haven't been explicitly told. One is that she's kind and considerate because she feels Lucy's got enough on, so she will buy the flowers. But we also have a sense of her capacity for happiness, her capacity to enjoy this warm spring day, and also the way her mind moves, which is the way all our minds move, from living in the present to reminiscences of the past to considerations of the future. We're always caught up in that sort of complicated temporal space. Now, another way, I think, of describing how Woolf does this is that she creates the impression of a kind of realism, which you might say was a kind of domestic psychological complexity that makes one think, yes, that is how the mind works. Well, C.S. Lewis used the term realism of presentation, and he illustrates it by talking about Chaucer's friar. And when the friar wants to sit down, he has to shoo the cat off the bench first. And that, the shooing of the cat off the bench, is the kind of realistic touch. It makes us think, yes, that is what life is like. And I think what Woolf's realism does is a kind of psychological version of that, sometimes known as stream of consciousness, although I think that term, stream of consciousness, rather oversimplifies Woolf's narrative technique. So the kind of reading I'm advocating, so this is how a critic, I think, reads, Woolf herself describes, and I quote, as opening the mind wide to the fast flocking of innumerable impressions. Opening the mind wide to the fast flocking of innumerable impressions. And that's the end of the quotation. And then reflecting on that process self-consciously. Now, I think this is how the critic, the literary critic, does it. A literary critic is something like a professional reader who's undergone a certain kind of training, but that doesn't mean we can't all become, we can't learn to read like critics. I mean, the more one reads and the more one reflects on reading, the more professional one becomes. But just as an aside, I would like to mention that there are, of course, a lot of formalised approaches to reading, which are part of a critic's sort of armoury. And I'd like to talk about one of these, just to give a brief insight into a very sort of scholarly and rigorous methodology. I'll then mention myriad other approaches to reading that literary critics may do before considering language's relationship to subliminal advertising and the role of rhetoric in literary criticism. So one of the most intellectually rigorous branches of literary criticism is classical textual criticism. So here you have an Anglo-Saxon text, and obviously it's a manuscript. And what the textual critic has to do is to try to work out what is the most authentic version of a story. So it will exist, there'll be numerous manuscripts, most of them won't be dated, there'll be no author. And so you have a pile of manuscripts, and what you want to know is what's the correct version of this? What's the most authentic version of this? Now, the Greeks were the first to worry about this, particularly with the works of Homer. They wanted to find out, well, which is the real Homer of all these manuscripts? We want the real thing, we want the authentic thing. Modern textual criticism was inaugurated by Karl Lachmann, who was a philologist and critic. His dates are 1793 to 1851. And the methodology that he established for working out what the authentic text was is pretty much the methodology that classical textual critics use today. So there are essentially 4 steps in the process. All 4 aren't necessarily aren't necessarily necessary in all cases. The first is called recensio, which is a review or assessment, which establishes a family tree of the various and varied manuscripts of a particular work. So this is the one we're going to be looking at. So what's called the archetype, that will be the authentic literary work, and we're trying to find out what that is. Selectio is the next one, where you compare family members to try and determine which is the oldest. Then there's examinatio, where you look for basic mistakes, scribal mistakes. And then there's emendatio or divinatio, which involves correcting the primitive errors. And then you have an archetype. Then you have what you consider to be the closest version of the literary work that it's possible to establish. So this is Woolston's 13th homily, and it's a pastoral letter in Anglo-Saxon. This is the scheme that accompanies it. So there are 5 extant manuscripts, and they are known as C, E, B, K, and M. The ones in brackets are lost manuscripts. So Dorothy Betherham, who's a well-known textual scholar, established this family tree for the Anglo-Saxon text. So the archetype gave rise to 2 other versions, version X and version Y, but they've been lost. Version Y gave rise to B, which is an extant manuscript, and the lost manuscript X gave rise to C and E. C then gave rise to Z, which again is a lost manuscript in brackets, and that gave rise to K and M. Yeah? So the ones in brackets are the lost ones, but you can establish that the text has gone via these versions. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that K and M are direct descendants of C. Yeah? So they go through the lost manuscript to C. Yeah? So they can't tell us anything new. And everything that's in C, all they're doing is drawing on C, so we can forget them. Now, C, E, and B are what are called primary witnesses, but their importance isn't equal. C and E derive from a common archetype, the lost X, and so their combined evidence is no greater than B alone. Yeah, so C and E are on a parallel, as it were. We know that C and E are dependent while B is independent, and this means that looking at BC against E, so the outer 2 against E, is a good one. That's going to bring some reward. And B against C likewise. But CE against B is less good because it's just one witness against another. Now, after you've established that, the next stage involves guesswork, because you have to choose one text against which to collate the other texts. Now, some scholars would go for the oldest manuscript, some the most complete, some the one that's freest from scribal errors. And once you've done that, you then start to collate them, to compare and contrast the various versions. There are various ways in which that can be done, and as you can imagine, this is a process which has been hugely facilitated by computer software, because you can now feed these manuscripts through and do all sorts of very, very clever comparisons. So this is one specialised form of literary critical reading, and you could say it comes at the very beginning of the family tree, because no literary critic can begin work on a text unless the text has been established as the authentic literary work. And after this sort of original work's been done by the textual scholars, literary critics then tend to come to works from a particular point of view. Marxist literary criticism is probably one of the best known. And there what you're trying to do is to determine the kind of political tendency of a literary work. Now, sometimes that's quite explicit, as in the case of Dickens, say. His political sympathies are always very evident. And Marx himself in 1854 said this included him among, and I quote, "the present splendid brotherhood of fiction writers in England, whose graphic and eloquent pages have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together." So I think it's pretty clear what a Marxist critic would do reading Dickens. He would be looking for power structures. She would be looking for the ways in which class is presented and so on. If you take something like Bronte's Jane Eyre, that's a rather subtler insight into class structure. But again, it's probably class structure that the Marxist critic would focus on. So class structure, power structures, these are the sorts of things that the Marxist critic will want to comment on. But there are many other forms of literary criticism: archetypal criticism, biographical criticism, the Chicago School, cultural materialism, Darwinian criticism, deconstruction, eco-criticism, feminist criticism, formalism, geocriticism, literary particularism, new criticism, new historicism, post-colonial criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, reader response criticism, Russian formalism, semiotic criticism, sociological criticism, source criticism, thing theory, no, not string theory, thing theory, queer theory. And there's also growing interest in what neuroscience can tell us about the reading process. Now, you'll be relieved to hear that we're not going to go through each and every one of these, and I'm not going to comment on what's particular to each approach. What I'd really like to do is to come back to this notion of how do we read as readers and how do we read as critics, and liken it to forms of subliminal advertising. So subliminal messages, for example, are stimuli that register below our level of consciousness or our conscious perception, and which are only noticed by the subconscious mind. And there's been a lot of research that suggests that subliminal advertising does work. So I'd just like to comment on 4 of my favourite examples. So FedEx, it's a logo that we're very familiar with, but how many of you looking at this can see more than letters? Please.
Arrow.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's an arrow in the space here. Now, I don't know how many of you saw that. I don't know if I hadn't been talking about subliminal advertising, whether you'd have seen it. I certainly hadn't seen it before I started thinking about this. But, I mean, obviously, the designer of this thought, if we have an arrow there, it suggests efficiency. It suggests that your parcel is going to go from A to B in a straight line, forward movement, energy, all those things. Hello?
Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Sorry about that. No, I think that's absolutely right. But these examples, I mean, they come in all shapes and forms. I think this was last year's Tour de France. You've seen the bicycle. So here we have the front wheel of the bike. Here we have the back wheel of the bike. And here we have the cyclist leaning over and his head. And again, I don't think one immediately sees that. One sees it as a rather designery logo for the Tour de France. Right.
There's a Swiss chocolate manufacturer at the mountains.
Yeah. Ah, nearly. The bear, indeed. There's a bear in the mountain. So there are his legs and his head. Yeah. Now, Toblerone was actually made in a town, and the emblem of the town was this bear. But again, I think subliminally it may be that it suggests that it's going to, be a really decent chocolate bar. It's going to fill you up. It would be sufficient to fill up the stomach of a bear. So what I want to suggest, one last one. Anyone want to A to Z, indeed. So the arrow takes you from A to Z. It takes you from A to Z with such force that it actually dents the bottom of the letter Z. And again, subliminally, I think it makes you think, or the designer must have thought it would make us think, that if you order from Amazon, A, you can order everything, A to Z. It's not limited in the way that it might be in a bookshop. And B, that it'll be dispatched to you very, very swiftly and with such force that it may leave a small dent on your front door. So what's this got to do with literary criticism and the difference between reading as a critic and reading as a reader? Well, I want you to imagine that the novel you're reading is printed on an acetate sheet, a clear piece of perspex. Now, when you read, if you're absorbed in your reading, if you're seduced by your reading, you don't really see the words on the acetate sheet. You see the world behind the sheet that's been created. And you're absorbed in that world, in that three-dimensional world. You're not particularly conscious of the words on the acetate sheet. You read them, but they take you straight in to that other world. Now, as a critic, you have to do two things simultaneously. You have to see the words on the acetate sheet whilst allowing those words to create the world of the novel. And being aware of the words on the acetate sheet, you have to be aware of what's going on, in a sense, subliminally, as in these visual images. And that's where rhetoric comes in. That's where understanding the complexities of language, which is one of the things that rhetoric gives us access to, helps us. So familiarity with figures of speech, which is essentially what rhetoric covers, allows the critic to identify how words make their impression on us. So what are figures of speech? Well, classical rhetoricians regarded them as the graces of the language, as the dressing of thought, as embellishment. So there's an idea that there's simple language, or through using figures of speech, you can embellish, you can add something else. Aristotle said that figures of speech add charm and distinction to our language, but also they provide a way to balance the obvious and the obscure so that listeners or readers understand what's being said or argued and would also be disposed to be persuaded by them. Quintilian defined figures as, I quote, any deviation either in thought or expression from the ordinary and simple method of speaking. A change analogous to the different positions our bodies assume when we sit down, lie back, or look back. Let the definition of a figure, therefore, and this is what he proposes, be a form of speech artfully varied from common usage. A form of speech artfully varied from common usage. And in a sense, I think those visual images of logos are the same thing. They've been artfully varied from what we first see. Yeah? Something clever is going on. It's not the simplest FedEx. It has an arrow embedded in it. And that's the artfulness. So figures are usually divided into two categories, schemes and tropes. And the former involve a deviation from the ordinary pattern or arrangement of words. So schemes are about juggling around with the conventional structure, say, of a sentence. And the latter, that's tropes, involve a deviation from the ordinary or principal signification of a word. So both involve a sort of transference, but one is about position or order, and the other is about meaning. So let's consider some examples, because I think that make things much easier. So this is Samuel Johnson on the character of the Reverend Zachariah Mudge, which sounds like a fictional name, but it isn't, from the London Chronicle of 1769. Though studious, he was popular. Though argumentative, he was modest. Though inflexible, he was candid. And though metaphysical, yet orthodox. Now, we recognise that Johnson's wit is at work here as he sums up a man's character with aphoristic neatness. But what's at work here to produce the effect is known as antithesis, or the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas, often in parallel structure. Though studious, he was popular. Though argumentative, he was modest. These are all antitheses. And it's used in advertising. It's a very ubiquitous device in advertising. A bottle of men's cologne by Dana was advertised with the slogan, "By the time it's empty, life will be full." I suppose it's a form of subliminal advertising. You don't need to know that antithesis is at work to be seduced by the idea that you'll have seduced a beautiful woman or two by the time you've used the bottle up. Compare these two quotations. The emotional isolation, the preoccupation with God and themselves, the struggles for freedom, which seem to have possessed many of my friends at the same age, I know almost nothing of. And then from Henry James, I got, so far as the immediate moment was concerned, away. Now, there's something surprising in these two examples. They certainly grab our attention. But the way in which they work is as a function of what's known as anastrophe, the inversion of the natural or usual word order. So here, in the CP Snow, it would be much more ordinary, much more common usage to say, I know almost nothing of the emotional isolation, the preoccupation, and so on and so forth. But as the emphasis comes at the beginning and end of the sentence, you get extra emphasis if you use this rhetorical device. And similarly, in The Turn of the Screw, you get this lovely, I got so far as the immediate moment was concerned away. So, I mean, again, conventionally you'd say, I got away as far as the immediate moment was concerned. And again, anastrophe crops up a good deal in advertising. Peugeot used one ad does not a survey make. Well, of course, conventionally we'd say one ad does not make a survey. So, same device. Schemes of repetition of initial or medial consonants in two or more adjacent words, which is known as alliteration, is obviously a common feature of traditional poetry. In fact, in Anglo-Saxon poetry, it was alliteration and not rhyme that bound verses together. And in one of my earlier lectures, I spoke about the delights of Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. And here are some lines which illustrate alliteration. I would hear him fly with the high fields and wake to the farm forever fled. 3 Fs at the beginning of those 3 words. The farm forever fled from the childless land. And again, the fizzy drink, lemonade drink, Sprite, realises that alliteration adds something tart, tingling, and even ticklish. Now, assonance is another common poetic effect, and that's where similar vowel sounds are preceded and followed by different consonants. So in another of Dylan Thomas's poems, this is the ballad for the long-legged bait, we have whales in the wake like capes and alps, quaked the sick sea and snouted deep. And so there, the A that I've italicized makes that quite clear. And again, French line ships came up with refresh your zest for living. And those E's in the refresh your zest. And what does it? Well, I don't want to work through a great sort of plethora of schemes, but I should mention one which is dear to Shakespeare, and that's anthemeria. Take this line from Coriolanus. A mile before his tent, fall down and knee the way into his mercy. So what's being said is, fall down on your knee and plead for mercy. And what Shakespeare's done is he said, well, I want one word there. I don't want kneel down. So I'll just take the noun knee, but use it as a verb. Knee the way into his mercy. And that's another quite common rhetorical device, and one which Shakespeare uses all the time in King Lear. The thunder would not peace at my bidding. So what Shakespeare's saying is that I couldn't quell the thunder, I couldn't control the thunder. I wanted it to quieten down, but I couldn't peace it at my bidding. And again, he's taken the noun peace and is simply using it as a verb. So turning to tropes, obviously the familiar ones are metaphor, irony, rhetorical questions, simile. But there are some more peculiar ones, and one I'd like to mention is oxesis, which is a kind of hyperbole or exaggeration, and it's used quite a lot by lawyers. And it's a way of suggesting that something is more serious than it really is. So, for example, a lawyer might refer to the wounds that had been inflicted rather than saying scratches, because it sounds a great deal more serious. And embezzlement might be used instead of petty pilfering. Anyway, enough of schemes and tropes. I want to move on to syntax. So we're going to build up from smaller units to bigger units. So syntax is essentially about sentence structure. And by using sentence structure in clever and creative ways, ideas can be stated, but they can also be stated in such a way as to give us insight into a mental process. So we're not just being told an idea, but the language is, in a sense, demonstrating a thought process in its structure. So here's Samuel Johnson again. If by excluding joy, actually, I should preface this by saying what Johnson is doing here is he's arguing with the Stoics, who said, if you don't want life to give you a hard time, just develop a tough shell. And Johnson didn't think this was the right way to go about life. And this is his argument. If by excluding joy we could shut out grief, the scheme would deserve very serious attention. So this is what he's saying in his 18th century language. If we say, okay, I'm not going to experience joy anymore, if that meant we would be guaranteed never to feel grief, then actually that might be quite persuasive. Might be worth insulating ourselves against grief by giving up joy. So he says, if by excluding joy we could shut out grief, the scheme would deserve very serious attention. But since, however we may debar ourselves from happiness, misery will find its way at many inlets. So he's saying, but this isn't the case, because even if we give up on happiness, misery will find its way. And the assaults of pain will force our regard. Though we may withhold it from the invitations of pleasure, so we could say, okay, I'm going to give up on pleasure, we may surely endeavour to raise life above the middle point of apathy at one time, since it will necessarily sink below it at another. Now, what Johnson is doing here is presenting something that's more than an argument about the fallacy of the Stoics' approach to life. But he's articulating it in a very convoluted syntax, and it's only really by using that convoluted and complicated syntax that he can really say what it is he wants to say. So we've got if ... we could, then but since ... however. Though we may ... we may surely ... since it will necessarily. So what Johnson's saying isn't straightforward or easily balanced. He's not saying that living without joy will prevent grief. He's not saying that abstaining from happiness will check misery. On the contrary, he's suggesting that pain, grief, and misery are part of the human condition and will afflict us whatever we do. But what's so compelling is this doesn't add up to a gloomy view of things. What the convoluted syntax does is to invert the potentially pessimistic outlook into one of hope. We must risk things in order to enjoy the upside. We may surely endeavour to raise life. Now, if I can be excused just from a brief sort of biographical conjecture, I could add that at this point in his life, Johnson was a very troubled man. He was highly regarded as one of the most intellectual and impressive figures of the 18th century, of course. But like many clever people, he lacked self-confidence. And he thought that his own thinking was pretty patchy, that some of his ideas he'd never really fully developed, or articulated, and he felt that there were contradictions in his own thinking. And it's that the complex syntax communicates so deftly. Johnson wasn't a philosopher, he was a writer, and a writer of consummate integrity. And he found a way of saying what he thought, and when this fell short of his own ideal, the language reflects the indecision. Johnson criticised writers who suggested ways of living, and I quote, in abstraction and in disengagement, exempt from the enticements of hope, the solicitations of affection, the importunities of appetite, or the depressions of fear. He didn't think it was right to try and shut those things out. And what we feel reading Johnson amid the complexity of his syntax is the weight of the emotions he describes. You feel a kind of familiarity with his own thinking. And one of the things Johnson said was, men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. Men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. In other words, that as a reader, you probably know quite a lot of what it is the writer's trying to say, but you may need to be reminded. It may need to be represented to you in a fresh way. So continuing on this trajectory of growing size or blocks of language, I'd just like to say something briefly about form. So we've gone from syntax and sentence structure, or more extensive sentence structure, and I now want to look at the first two chapters of Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, which he wrote in 1864-5. Now, as many of you will know, the novel opens at night on the River Thames here in London. Here's a contemporary illustration. The tide is rising, and in the muddy darkness a boat appears amid the floating logs, rubbish and barges. The boat's being rowed by a small girl whose angelic face is half hidden by the hood of her cloak. But dominating the boat, a man is standing up, well, this is a little bit later, standing up at the prow, looking out over the water with hungry eyes, clearly looking for something. By the 19th century, the visual has come to dominate the novel. This wasn't the case in the 18th century. The novel becomes very visual, and it continues to become more and more visual until the rise of cinema. And the opening of Our Mutual Friend is strikingly cinematic, some decades before the advent of film in the 1890s. Now, what is this unlikely pair looking for? We soon discover that the man is looking for the corpses of murder victims and suicides. The waters of the Thames provide rich pickings. The man empties the dead's pockets of money and delivers the corpses to a nearby police station, where he's also offered a reward for his labours. The girl, the man's daughter, turns her head away from the macabre sight of the bodies, terrified by her father's work. And as Italo Calvino writes in a brilliant essay on Dickens' novel, and I quote, "Carried along on the corpse fisher's boat, we seem to enter the dark side of the world." Now, the tension is maintained in a very extraordinary way. So the opening chapter is macabre, is extraordinarily disturbing. But chapter 2 could be the opening of a completely different novel. And we read on partly because we're trying to work out how on earth can this be chapter 2 of the novel where I've just read chapter 1. And we're suddenly immersed in a dinner party. And the hosts are Mr. and Mrs. Veneering. And the reader quickly realises that everything about them is veneer. And here is the opening. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering were brand new people in a brand new house in a brand new quarter of London. Everything about the Veneerings was spick and span new. Oh, sorry, I have to apologise that I've left the D off brand. I hope you've spotted that. All their furniture was new, all their friends were new, all their servants were new. Their plate was new, their carriage was new, their harness was new, their horses were new, their pictures were new, they themselves were new. They were as newly married as was lawfully compatible with their having a brand new baby. And if they'd set up a great-grandfather, he would have come home in matting from the Pantechnicon without a scratch upon him, French polished to the crown of his head. Now, a pantechnicon we think of as a kind of van, but there was actually a British company called Pantechnicon, and their lorries would store furniture and deliver furniture. So here it's the name of the store. So here's a contemporary illustration. I like the waiter with his nose in the air. Now everyone at the dinner party gives the impression of knowing everyone else, but this is a facade. The atmosphere is very much one of a comedy of manners, until just before the end of the chapter, when the conversation turns to the story of a man who drowned just as he was about to inherit a fortune. So we're suddenly taken back to the scene of the boatman and his daughter in the murky waters of the Thames and the atmosphere of death. Turns out that the fortune that the young man was about to inherit was made out of rubbish. His father had essentially opened rubbish dumps. And the theme of detritus, also introduced in the first chapter, continues. And throughout the novel, in fact, whenever the scene is one of luxury and brightness, we recognise that this is only a flimsy disguise, and behind is the grim and desolate reality of the world. The young man's father has made his fortune in the London suburbs, where enormous rubbish heaps in a field surround his house. Now, Dickens crafts the novel brilliantly, as these apparently disparate sections are artfully woven together. Likewise, the metaphorical texture, as detritus, greed, and evil are brought into intimate relationship. The rhetoric of Dickens' language is also deft. He's a master of the simile, bringing characters and scenes to life, sometimes with extraordinary economy, sometimes at greater length, as when he wants to suggest the sprawl of the city. In terms of character, imagine someone, and I quote, with an immense, obtuse, drab, oblong face, like a face in a teaspoon. It's a brilliant image conveying a kind of sense of dumb stubbornness. Or to conjure an image of someone's, quote, neck and nostrils like a rocking horse. I didn't realise that I'd remembered what the nostrils of a rocking horse are like. But in terms of setting, instead of using the simile, this being like that, Dickens develops a long section which again has a purpose. A grey, dusty, withered evening in London City has not a hopeful aspect. The closed warehouses and offices have an air of death about them, and the national dread of colour has an air of mourning. The towers and steeples of the many house-encompassed churches, dark and dingy as the sky that seems descending on them, are no relief to the general gloom. A sundial on a church wall has the look, in its useless black shade, of having failed in its business enterprise and stopped payment forever. So Dickens begins by personifying London. The people of London may or may not feel hope, but we don't generally think of a city in this way. The evening is described as withered, an adjective we generally associate with living things, not a time of day. And the atmosphere of decay is made explicit in the mention of death, although associated with offices and warehouses, which are not living beings. This is picked up in the air of mourning, attributed to a national dread of colour. All is dark, decaying, deathly. The atmosphere is also one of claustrophobia. The churches are house-encompassed, and the sky seems to be, quote, descending on them. To the blackness, decay, and death, we can add dark, dingy, and gloom. The final image of the sundial is an intriguing one. It's described as having failed in its business enterprise. But this is evening, presumably after the sun has set, and a sundial can only provide an indication of time if the sun is up. But the failed business enterprise, which has stopped payment, is linked back to the closed warehouses and offices with their air of death about them. So essentially what the passage is describing is a failing urban economy. And the church, and by extension religion, can bring no comfort, as the towers and steeples, which might otherwise symbolize hope, provide no relief. So the brevity of the simile that I quoted earlier, the immense, obtuse, drab, oblong face, like a face in a teaspoon, contrasts with this extensive description of London in the evening. And the length is not otiose. The reader is stuck in the long description, just as he or she might feel stuck in the streets of London with the sky descending. So our experience of reading this lengthy description is a kind of parallel of actually being there and feeling the claustrophobia and feeling that it's a maze that we need to find our way out of. So as a reader, we see the decaying scene that Dickens conjures and we feel the claustrophobia and the hopelessness, but we don't necessarily see the words on the acetate sheet and recognize how the rhetoric works. We don't necessarily see how the subliminal aspects of the language are working. And the chief responsibility of the critic, I think, is to explain how literature makes its effect. And writers, likewise, have to use language which will beguile the reader. The facts, to return to Virginia Woolf's distinction, that we read in washing machine instructions do not conjure, they state. And it's this capacity of language, novels in particular, to beguile us that I'd like to explore in my next lecture on Tuesday the 13th of May. And that will be the concluding lecture of this academic year 6. Its title is How Novels Beguile. Thank you.